Hey. Am I wearing a t-shirt that I saw Harry Styles trending on Twitter wearing? 1,000%. Am I ashamed of that? 1,000%. Today I wanted to show you a little bit of one of my collections. If you know me, I collect a lot of things. I have a lot of different collections. I have a camera collection. I have a collection of art books. I have a collection of many things. Just general art collection. But today I wanted to show you some of my art books. Not three of my faves, but three that have really made a difference in the way that I look at work and how I even perceive my own work. So let's get crack-a-lackin'. I get a lot of my books on either Amazon or from museums themselves. I found that getting them from museums is really great when they clearance them out, especially at the end of different shows. Like I got my Andy Warhol one because it was on the tail end of the show closing, so they were just clearancing them all out, which is great. And a lot of these, I have like about 50-50 or about 20, or like a third bought from museums and a third bought from Amazon. I always double check the Amazon price because a lot of times you can get used books, which I'd much rather buy a used book anyway. So I end up going there a lot of the time. But this Chuck Close book, I was just looking for a book of his because I admire his work, and it's something that's not in my realm or scheme of things that I do. So for me, it's really interesting to see his technique and see the way that he works because it's so different from anything that I do, except for the production side of things. He does some stuff that's very highly produced. This self-titled book, Chuck Close, was published by the Museum of Modern Art in 1998. The artist is a painter, photographer, and printmaker who received his bachelor's from the University of Washington and his MFA from Yale. The artist is known for both hyper and photorealistic portraits, which can be seen throughout his entire body of work. Here's what the book looks like. It was previously a library book, so in my opinion, it's really in really great shape. I find particularly that art books that used to be library books are in terrific shape because they're not necessarily pulled out in a library super often. They're not handheld read or taken home super often either, so they're maintained pretty well. This one was actually ironically from West Virginia, which is where my dad's from, so I thought that was kind of funny. A few things I want to show from this book is the first few pages are super big close-ups of different works of his, which is really nice to see because he does his formations very differently in different materials. So you can see, like, this one's some of his later stuff that I've seen a lot of these ones where they're made up of little circles that are different colors and different shapes. And here's a close-up of one that I really like that's made of all paper pulp. So you can see all of the layers, and rather than using oil paint to make that depth, he used paper pulp, which is nuts to me. These ones are some of the true hyper-realistic ones that he's made. So these look exactly like photos, but they're massive. They're, bigger than me, and I'm 6'3". They're at least 7 feet tall. Oh yeah, this one's 90 inches. So that's 90 inches wide, so you can only imagine how big it is. He's really known for these hyper photorealistic paintings, which I really appreciate, and I've gotten to see a couple in person, and they're really awesome. It's something that I would never even fathom to start beginning to do. So here's a really good little excerpt from one of the passages by Kirk Van Doe. It says, "The working process was revealed as an odd variant on assembly line logic, parceling the task into a grid of separate but repetitious units, allowing the artist to, in his own words, sneak up on the image by a series of indirect advances, working alternatively and idiosyncratically on different zones or different component layers of the whole, constantly delaying concentration on the end result." So he works in grids, so that's how he's able to make and manipulate these different spots, particularly like the ones that have the circles, and form an image kind of like photo pixels on digital images now, which is awesome, and it's a really interesting way to work, and that's like one of the biggest ways that I could relate his stuff to mine, in the sense that he works similarly to a printmaker in different spots and different pieces to then create the final image rather than working on the final image all at once, which is really interesting. This next one is one that I got in Chicago from the Art Institute. It is a female artist. Her name is Suzanne Rothenberg.
It's Susan, not Suzanne. You dumb bitch.
Susan Rothenberg, Moving in Place, was published in 2009 by the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth and Bristol. She is a painter, printmaker, and draftswoman who received her BFA from Cornell and studied at George Washington University. Susan's work blurs the line between two-dimensional figure and three-dimensional reality. Her work is really interesting, and it follows similar aesthetics to, she's been compared to Georgia O'Keeffe. She kind of goes in depth in this book and online, saying how they're totally different people and stuff, which is totally accurate, don't get me wrong. Her work has a very abstract expressionism, but abstract, realistic aesthetic to it, if that makes any sense. Her early stuff follows a lot of indigenous themes and aesthetics, which unfortunately happens with a lot of white artists of the time, which is kind of just a tale of the times, and things are changing now, but that was the case back then. So, and her current work isn't as focused on that, which is nice, and I actually personally prefer her newer work, but you obviously can't get to the newer stuff until you've had the older stuff. So this horse, Cabin Fever, is one of her works that's really well known. It's the catalyst for a lot of other works. So she uses the figuration, particularly the legs that are moving right here, to then in turn make some figurations of hands, and it kind of goes from the figuration of the horse's legs. It's kind of cool. It like transitions from animal to human, which is a really interesting concept, and more gets taken away as she progresses with this idea. One of my favorites, or some of my favorites as a part of a series, are from her works in the early 2000s, so around 2003, I think, to 2008. She has a lot of these arms that are derivative of some of that original stuff she was doing, but in a much more interesting way, because they're detached and disconnected from humans, so they have this really interesting day-to-day, everyday man aesthetic without being attached to human, which I really think is interesting.
We get it. Everything's interesting.
Her transformative work, she said, it's about being ready to go and then going nowhere. The horse is held in place with a line down the middle. It was fascinating that a simple line could stop an image, hold it up in place. I'm not sure it does, but that was the idea. I like the background shadows in the painting. It creates a little space between with the horse to operate. So she's talking about this figure that's stagnant but still moving, which is interesting because she takes away any of the three-dimensional aspects of the figures and makes them really flat, which is super, like, very much a printmaker thing to do. But this is playing into the ideas of reality and movement and human connection, or even animal connection in this case, and how that then translates kind of into her arm works, those little scenes that have those disconnected arms. It goes into that idea of starting in one place and ending in another, and having a reality change somewhere in there, which I think is brilliant. The final book I'm going to talk about today is Charles Ray. The self-titled book, Charles Ray, was published in 1998 by the Museum of Contemporary Art, LA, and Scalo Verlang of Zurich. The American artist is a sculptor and received his BFA from the University of Iowa and his MFA from Rutgers. The key to his work is all about perception. He was influenced by artists Anthony Caro, and David Smith. And Charles Ray is an artist I really, really admire. He's a sculpture artist that just really pushed a lot of boundaries at the time. Particularly in his earlier stuff, he really did a lot of work that basically spoke about his interaction with drugs and how he looked, felt, and acted while under the influence of those drugs, which is really interesting, especially for the time that they were made, which is the height of drug, I guess, the hippie child, flower child kind of induced era of the 70s. So it's really cool to see those works. Some of his stuff that I really enjoy stems in the 80s. I love a lot of 80s art. It's somewhere in between because of effects and makeup artistry and whatnot. A lot of sculpture is held in a place that things don't look very real at all, to be honest. And that's kind of the best part because they look completely real and you can tell that they're fake a lot sooner, which I think it makes these a lot more impactful. Charles Ray is known for a lot of these mannequins that are larger than life. As you can see, that's the artist next to the mannequin. So you can see this female mannequin is massive. So it plays into this idea of the mannequin looking real, but also being larger than life, so you know immediately that it can't be real, but also playing into our perceptions of reality in consumerism and seeing mannequins themselves and having it being larger than life. It really speaks on a lot of those terms, which is very different for the time. If you've ever gone to the Art Institute in Chicago, you have seen this one, the boy. He's really creepy. He's just this young boy in they're not pinafores, but whatever you would call a shorts version of a pinafore. Yeah, it just really plays into this weird mid-reality where these mannequins look real, but they're not, and they have humanness to them, but they're obviously massive, so they can't be real. So this one's hard to understand in photographs. It's better to try to see if you can find some different angles of it online, or if there's potentially a video. I don't know if there is. If I find one, I'll link it below. But this one is called Yes, and it's one of the ones that he took while on drugs. I believe this one's LSD that he was on. And you can kind of see there's this curvature to the image, and that's because you can somewhat see down here at the bottom they've actually installed a wall in the front of the original wall that is curved so that it looks like it's bubbling out towards you, so it gives you a similar effect that you would have on those drugs. I've seen this done in different ways where it'll be a mirror that distorts your vision, and it's meant to give a similar aesthetic. So this frame is perfectly aligned to the wall, so it looks like it's attached directly to the wall, which it obviously is, but it's not just like a flat picture on the caved wall, which is crazy and cool and an awesome idea. Charles Ray's his earlier work involved himself. His physical body was in the work, and then he later in turn pushed that into making mannequins of himself, so it kind of has a similar context to it. And one of the lines I love from this book is written by Schimmel, and it says, Ray's move to the use of his own body as a sculptural element was a natural progression from this belief, the belief that a sculpture is more than just an object. He began to believe with great conviction that his sculpture was intrinsically in a physical activity that needed to take place every day. So he believed firmly that sculpture was meant to be part of life and part of the human experience. So he, in turn, made himself into sculpture. So there's a couple photos here of him being a sculpture against the wall with a board, making himself part of the gallery space, which is awesome because it's an element of performance while being sculptural at the same time. I think with that, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you for tuning in and letting me show you some silly art stuff. I think it's really interesting. I think you might think it's interesting. Hopefully you learned something. I'll see you later. Bye.